3 weeks before my daughter's wedding, everything in my life that felt simple got turned inside out by a single certified letter, the kind with a stamped return address and a tone that already assumes you're going to obey before you even read the full page. I was standing in the kitchen of our house in Willow Creek, coffee still brewing, when I opened it, and I remember reading the first paragraph twice because my brain refused to accept that someone could actually be this serious about something so personal. It was from the Homeowners Association, signed by the president, Linda Mercer, stating that our planned backyard wedding for my daughter Emily, 85 guests, full ceremony under the oak trees, was denied under Section 8.2 of the Community Covenants, with a violation penalty of $500 per day if we proceeded. No negotiation, no discussion, just a formal no to something that, in my mind, was never really theirs to approve in the first place. Emily was sitting at the kitchen island at the time, going through seating arrangements, and I didn't even say anything right away because I needed a second to understand how to tell my daughter that the place she grew up, the backyard she learned to walk in, run in, and eventually dream in, was suddenly being treated like a rented space she no longer had control over. I'm Mason Carter, 52 years old, commercial real estate development, mostly across the Carolinas and Virginia, and I've spent more than 2 decades dealing with zoning boards, county planners, legal disputes over land use, and people who believe rules are either absolute or optional, depending on who is holding them. So I know paperwork, I know authority structures, and I know when something smells off. But nothing in my professional life prepared me for how personal it feels when that authority is pointed directly at your family. Emily didn't argue when I showed her the letter. She just went quiet, the kind of quiet that says more than frustration ever could, and she asked me softly if we should just move the wedding somewhere else to avoid problems. That's when it hit me, not just the situation, but what it was doing to her, because she wasn't thinking about fighting anything. She was thinking about protecting peace, and that's what made it worse. I told her to leave it with me, not because I had a plan yet, but because I didn't want her carrying that weight. The truth is, I didn't call the HOA. I didn't argue. I didn't react the way they probably expected. Instead, I went upstairs to my office, closed the door, and pulled every document I could find on Willow Creek Residential Association, starting with the subdivision plat, then the original covenants, then state corporate filings. The deeper I went, the quieter everything around me became, because I started realizing this wasn't just a strict HOA enforcing rules. This was something structurally wrong. The association had been administratively dissolved back in 2004. No reinstatement. No updated registration. Nothing. Legally speaking, it had been dead for over 20 years. I double-checked, thinking I had misread something, because it almost felt too clean, too simple, like a hidden truth that should not have been sitting in plain sight. Then I called a county contact I had worked with years ago, a guy named Raymond who still owed me a favor from a development project outside Durham. I asked him a simple question: if an HOA has been administratively dissolved for that long, are their covenants still enforceable? There was a pause, then he laughed and said, "Mason, if the entity is dead, the authority is dead with it." That sentence sat in my head longer than I expected, because it changed the entire frame of what I was dealing with. It wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a system that didn't know it was already over. I started pulling payment records next, and that's when the second layer appeared. Homeowners had still been paying dues, fines, and assessments into this structure for years, decades in some cases, under the assumption that it was legitimate. And the more I looked, the more uncomfortable it got, because this wasn't just about Emily's wedding anymore. It was about a whole neighborhood operating under a shared illusion of authority. The next step wasn't anger, it was verification. I started talking to neighbors, first the ones I trusted, Greg and Dana Mitchell 2 houses down, then Mr. Ellison who had lived there longer than almost anyone else. I didn't present it as a confrontation, I just laid out the documents and watched their reactions change in real time. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a kind of slow recognition that something they had accepted for years didn't actually have a legal backbone. Greg looked at me and said, "So every fine we ever paid, every warning letter, all of that was coming from nothing." And I told him, that's what it looks like on paper. That was the moment things started spreading faster than I expected, because once people realize authority isn't anchored in law, they stop treating it as untouchable. Over the next few days I went door to door more than I wanted to, not because I was trying to start a movement, but because people kept asking questions once they saw the documents. Some were angry, some were embarrassed, some were just stunned that they had never thought to question it. A retired nurse named Valerie told me she had paid dues for 17 years and never once considered checking the corporate status of the association collecting her money. That stuck with me more than anything, not because she was careless, but because it showed how easily systems survive on assumption. Emily kept trying to stay focused on wedding planning during all of this, tasting cakes, talking to the florist, trying to keep life normal while I was clearly pulled into something else. And I kept telling her not to worry, but I could feel the situation growing teeth. Eventually, we reached the point where ignoring it wasn't possible anymore. I worked with an attorney, Daniel Reeves, and we drafted a formal petition to trigger legal review based on the subdivision governance structure itself, which felt ironic given that the same structure had been enforced by an entity that no longer legally existed. We needed signatures from a majority of homeowners to initiate the review. At first it moved slowly, people hesitant to commit, unsure if they wanted to challenge the system they had lived under for so long. But once a few early households signed, momentum shifted. It stopped being theoretical and became collective. I started noticing something else around that time too. Linda Mercer was watching. Not openly at first, but in the way her car would pass slowly down the street, or how conversations at neighborhood gatherings got quieter when she was nearby. When she finally came to speak to me directly, she tried to frame it as confusion and misunderstanding, insisting that everything she had done was for community stability, that rules only work if they are enforced consistently. But what she didn't seem to realize was that consistency doesn't matter if the foundation underneath is gone. And by the time the petition reached the threshold needed for formal review, the situation had already moved beyond conversation. It wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was about whether anything they had enforced for 20 years actually had legal weight at all, and what would happen when a county finally looked closely enough to confirm the answer. By the time the petition crossed the threshold for a formal review, it felt like the neighborhood had split into two versions of itself, the one people had always believed they were living in, and the one the paperwork was slowly revealing underneath it. I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was anxious in the way people assume, but because once you've seen a system start to wobble, your brain keeps running through every possible outcome like it's trying to simulate control over something that's already in motion. Emily kept asking me if everything was okay, and I kept giving her the same answer, that it was handled, that she should focus on her wedding. But the truth was I was watching something larger than a wedding problem take shape. Daniel Reeves called me one morning and told me the county had accepted the petition for review, which meant enforcement actions were effectively frozen while they evaluated the legal standing of the HOA. That was the moment everything changed in a very quiet way, because suddenly Linda Mercer wasn't operating from authority anymore. She was operating from memory. The letters still existed, the rules were still printed, but the legal force behind them had stopped moving. I remember walking through the neighborhood that evening just to clear my head. And it felt different, not physically, but socially. People were talking more openly on porches, comparing notes, showing each other old violation notices, realizing they had all been receiving the same kind of pressure for years without ever questioning the source. It wasn't anger yet, more like delayed recognition, the kind that builds slowly before it turns into something else. Greg Mitchell waved me over from his driveway and said, "So what happens now?" And I told him honestly, now the county decides whether anything they've been enforcing even counts. He shook his head and said, "I can't believe none of us checked this sooner," and I didn't have a comforting answer for that, because the truth is most people don't check systems that appear stable until something forces them to. Meanwhile, Linda didn't step back. If anything, she leaned harder into control. I saw her SUV more often, slow passes down streets, brief stops near homes where conversations were happening, like she was trying to measure the spread of something she could no longer contain. Then one afternoon she showed up at my house directly. No appointment, no letter, just standing on the porch with that same composed expression she always used when she thought she still held authority. She told me the petition was unnecessary, that misunderstandings were being exaggerated, and that the HOA had always operated in good faith. I remember listening to her carefully because there was something revealing in the way she spoke, not legal confidence, but emotional certainty, like belief was supposed to be enough to replace paperwork. I told her calmly that good faith doesn't replace legal standing. And for the first time I saw hesitation in her face, just a flicker, but enough to show she understood the difference and didn't like it. After she left, Daniel called again to walk me through the next step, and that's when he shifted from review to litigation. He explained that because the HOA had been operating under a dissolved corporate structure while continuing to collect fees and issue enforcement actions, individual board members could be held personally liable for misrepresentation and unjust enrichment. That changed the temperature of everything. It stopped being a neighborhood disagreement and became a legal exposure situation. The filing went in shortly after, and I remember reading my daughter's wedding invitations on the kitchen counter while legal documents sat next to them. Two completely different worlds sharing the same space without acknowledging each other. Emily noticed the shift. Of course she did. She's not naive. One night she asked me directly if this was still about the wedding, and I told her no, not really, not anymore. And that's when she got quiet in a different way, the kind that comes from realizing adults are dealing with something bigger than they're explaining. Linda tried to regain control through escalation. Phone calls, messages. Even a visit where she offered what she called an exception for the wedding, as if the issue was still within her authority to grant or deny. But by then the language didn't land the same way. It sounded outdated, like someone reading rules from a book that had already been taken off the shelf by the system that created it. The county review progressed faster than expected once financial records were formally requested. That part surprised a lot of people, but it shouldn't have. When you start following money tied to an inactive corporate structure, clarity tends to come quickly. Fees, fines, maintenance charges, all of it was documented under an entity that no longer legally existed, which meant the accounting didn't just raise questions, it created liability. I didn't celebrate that realization. It felt heavier than that, because it meant a lot of people had been participating in something none of us fully understood, including the people enforcing it. Around that same time, the neighborhood started preparing for the wedding again, almost like a parallel track running beside the legal process. Chairs being delivered, lights being tested in the backyard, Emily going back and forth with the florist, trying to keep the emotional center of her life intact while everything else shifted around it. I watched her more closely than I said out loud, because I knew she didn't care about the HOA outcome nearly as much as she cared about whether her day would feel normal. And that's what I kept trying to protect, even while everything else was unraveling. By the time the weekend approached, the county had effectively frozen enforcement, the lawsuit was in motion, and whatever version of authority Linda believed she still had was functionally gone, even if she hadn't fully accepted it yet. And I remember thinking that sometimes the most unstable moment in any system isn't when it collapses, but when it's already collapsed legally and people are still acting like it hasn't. The day everything finally came to a head at the county building didn't feel like a climax at first. It felt almost boring, which is something I've learned is usually how real endings show up, not with noise, but with paperwork and tired fluorescent lighting, and people trying not to look too emotional in hallways that have seen too many disputes. Linda Mercer arrived early, sitting off to the side like she was trying to prepare herself for a version of reality she hadn't fully accepted yet. When she saw me, she gave a small nod and said she wished things hadn't escalated. I told her I believed her, but that doesn't change where we are now. Inside the room, Daniel Reeves didn't waste time on storytelling. He never does. He just laid everything out in a way that made arguments unnecessary: dissolution records, county confirmations, bank histories, enforcement notices tied to a corporate entity that hadn't legally existed for years. It wasn't dramatic. It was just organized truth sitting next to disorganized authority, and over time that imbalance becomes impossible to defend. Linda tried to frame her actions as community management, as maintaining order when others wouldn't, but the county attorney stopped her at one point and asked if homeowners were ever informed that the HOA had been administratively dissolved. There was a pause long enough that everyone in the room understood the answer before she even spoke. She said they had continued in good faith, and Daniel gently replied that good faith doesn't create legal authority. That was really the moment it ended, not with a ruling, but with recognition. After a couple hours, it was done in the quietest way possible, findings acknowledged, liabilities noted, no speeches, no final confrontation, just the end of something that had been standing on assumption for a very long time. When we walked out, Daniel said, "It's finished," and I remember not feeling victorious so much as relieved in a very muted way, like setting down something I didn't realize I'd been carrying for years. In the weeks that followed, everything moved through the system the way these things do, slowly but inevitably. The HOA was formally dissolved, financial records were reviewed, and restitution was ordered for improperly collected fees, with board members held personally responsible once insurance refused coverage for intentional misrepresentation tied to a non-existent entity. The neighborhood didn't fall apart, but it changed shape. The HOA premium that had been baked into property values disappeared almost immediately in appraisals, and over the next few months homes adjusted downward in value somewhere in the range of roughly 20%, depending on location and condition. It wasn't a crash, it was a recalibration, like the market finally admitting it had been pricing in something that wasn't actually there. People reacted in different ways. Some were angry, some were embarrassed, some just went quiet because there isn't a comfortable way to process the idea that you've been paying into a system that technically shouldn't have existed. Linda's situation became more personal than public. Her home, which she had been preparing to sell for retirement, suddenly no longer carried the value she expected, and from what I heard she delayed the listing, then withdrew it entirely while trying to figure out what her next step was. I didn't follow it closely. At a certain point, you stop needing updates. What stayed with me wasn't the legal outcome or the financial ripple effect. It was the wedding itself. Because despite everything leading up to it, and everything that came after, that day never felt touched by the conflict. Emily walked down the aisle under the oak trees like the rest of the world had agreed to stay quiet for a while. There was music, laughter, people she loved gathered without tension. And for a few hours, everything was exactly what she had wanted from the beginning, not perfect in a polished way, but real in a way that mattered. Later that night, after everyone left and the lights were still swaying slightly in the warm air, I sat on the back steps with Claire looking out at the yard. She asked me if I regretted how far everything went, and I didn't answer right away because I was thinking about all of it, the letter, the records, the petition, the moment things shifted from personal to structural. Finally, I told her I didn't regret protecting the wedding, but I also understood something I didn't fully understand before, that most systems people treat as permanent only work because nobody tests them. And once someone does, you find out very quickly whether it was real authority or just confidence that hadn't been challenged yet. Because in the end, nothing in Willow Creek collapsed loudly. It simply stopped pretending. And the part people still argue about when I tell this story isn't the law, or even the money. It's whether I should have warned them first, or whether letting it unfold the way it did was the only way it could have ended once the truth was already sitting in plain sight.